Without any further delay, please welcome Dawn and Gabriel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you everyone for being here on such a wet and cold evening. So special thanks for making that effort, and to come to such a sunny and lively. I think the contrast between the outside and the inside here is pretty remarkable. I'll just say a few words before asking Dawn some questions. First of all, I think congratulations, Carmen. This is just a stunning exhibition, and it's very moving to be here for those of us who met Ofelia, and she was very special, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but someone you didn't ignore. Like, she made, I think, a big impact on all of us, and sadly lived in some kind of obscurity. So I think this exhibition, which brings her on this scale and with this force, it kind of took my breath away when I walked in, and just to see what a fantastic artist she was. I mean, we knew it, but we forget these things. And I feel that she's very present in this exhibition. She's very well represented, and I think she'll be extremely proud of the work you did. So just many congratulations to you, Carmen, and to everyone at Spike Island for taking on a project like this. It's so great and just so moving to see it. So thank you. Dawn, we were working together at Essex at the time that we met Ofelia, and maybe should we do a little bit of memory lane and remember how we met her and the context in which we met her?
Well, it's quite funny, because coming down on the train, I said to Gabriel, well, of course, when did you introduce me to Ofelia? And he said, no, you introduced me to Ofelia. And then we realized, in fact, it was Nicholas Elam who introduced both of us to Ofelia, because you had met her earlier on as an artist at a sort of Latin American symposium. So it was just the moment when we were contemplating, with the help of Gabriel and his friend Charles Cossack, setting up a collection of art from Latin America at the University of Essex. And I'd been teaching Latin American art and pre-Columbian art for how many years? I mean, sort of...
At that point,
25 years or so. And it was exciting and successful, but there was almost no work from Latin America to be seen in the UK. So enterprising students, postgraduate students like Gabriel, decided it was time we started a collection. And so it began. And I think, I don't know whether Ofelia was in the very earliest iteration.
I think this work, in my memory, was at the opening, which was 30 years ago. On December 13th will be 30 years ago, the day of Santa Lucia.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
The saint of eyesight. It wasn't chosen for that reason, but it was a nice coincidence.
Yeah.
I think she was in the first show, if not very soon after.
Very soon after. Yeah. She could well have been, because she was there from the very beginning. And she was hugely helpful and positive about what was basically, it was an enterprise at the university which had no official support whatsoever, or funding. So we basically said, we've got to have a collection. You know, artists are willing to give their work, and artists weren't giving their work to us because they wanted to be, to have a sort of foothold, if you like, in the UK. I mean, it really was important. So there was a great deal of interest and support from artists in Latin America at the time. And Ofelia, of course, by then was living in London, but very clearly was presenting herself, in a sense, as a Latin American artist. I think that's something we'll come back to.
I think one of the really interesting things is, of course, we were studying art in Latin America, art from Latin America. There were many of us working on different aspects, from Andean textiles to geometric abstraction in Argentina, a wide range of subjects, but it was all over there. And one of the, I think, maybe unintended consequences of starting this project in England is that there was this community of Latin American artists who were living in the UK, who emerged, and Ofelia was a great example of that, who were kind of like, hey, you know, we're here too. And many, many, many more than I would have expected. I remember Ana Plasencia,
Ana Maria Pacheco.
Ana Maria Pacheco. So one of the really interesting things was to start to see just how much presence there was of artists from Latin America living in the UK at that time. This is the early 1990s. It was an unrecognizable art world. Dawn had just done a big exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in 1989, which I think it's okay to say was, what would be the term?
The exhibition?
Yeah. I think critically was...
It was basically not understood at all. It was described as an exhibition by a sort of a rather Marxist student who was interested in history. And the only part of the exhibition that, well, I would say two things. One is that it was a very scholarly exhibition and catalogue, and it did include a lot of manifestos and writings by artists in the catalogue, which I think was very useful and helpful. But there was part of the exhibition was curated by Guy Brett, who was a great, great champion of Latin American art. And he did a wonderful room, which was Lydia Clark, Lydia Pape, and so on. And that was really the one that I think received the most positive critical reaction. Would you think true?
I think that's true, but just all to say that the environment in the early 90s for international art, I guess in general, this was just before the emergence of the young British artists, or about that time, but it was a much more insular art world than it is today. I think unrecognizably, so in terms of the difference. And so it was very interesting to start to see, in spite of that, in spite of the institutional disinterest, which was huge, there were artists who were living and working in the United Kingdom. And I think this project became kind of a beacon to them. It became a place where they could connect to professors, to students, to people who were interested in their work and who had a context from which they could read that work. So Ofelia was definitely one of those artists.
And given what you have been engaged in subsequently in the United States and in New York, which has a rather different relationship, rather different history of involvement with artists from Latin America, could you say something about how that was different in the States from here?
Sure.
Over the last 20 years or so, 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the already in the 90s there was Latino art, or what's today is called Latinx art. And that was known, and that was a phenomenon, and that was taken seriously and studied. And of course, one of the big differences is that in the United States, Latin America is a domestic issue. There's a border with Mexico, there's immigration, and there are states in which the Hispanic population is a majority. You can go today to Miami and speak Spanish from the moment the plane lands, and you don't need to speak English anymore. There's also the United States political involvement in Latin America, which has been, very intense through the 20th century. So the UK was very different that way. It doesn't have a huge migration from Latin America. It doesn't have a land border. It hasn't had a recent history of political intervention in Latin America on the scale of the United States. So I think the big difference for me is that the Latino project in the United States is by definition a political project. It's a project for recognition, it's a project for representation, and in the UK it wasn't. And one of the really interesting things about the artists is how incredibly eccentric they were. And so Ofelia's work is like nothing. I mean, there are some references, but it's wacky, it's weird, it's personal. She wasn't part of any movement. They didn't publish any manifestos. She was her own person. Ana Maria Pacheco in Norwich was absolutely her own. She created a visual universe that was absolutely hers, absolutely her own. And we found this kind of Lucia Nogueira, an artist who was working in London, who died very young. Also, just artists who were 100% focused on creating a personal language, visual language, without ever feeling the need to sort of articulate that into a larger project. So I think that's sort of the main difference, and Ofelia is such a great example of that. Her work had nothing to do with, she didn't want to be part of the British art scene. It had nothing to do with what was being made there. It didn't even have that much to do with what was being made in Colombia. I mean, there are certain connections we can make, but she really did manage to do that hardest thing for an artist, which is develop their own vocabulary and their own language, and we see it here several decades of work that is only hers. It's unconfusable with anything else. And so I think part of that may have been from this, maybe, I imagine, emotionally difficult position to maintain, of being such an outsider, of being an artist who had so few exhibitions, of so little kind of critical response. And maybe the flip side to that, maybe I'm being over-optimistic here, but is that creative freedom to develop your work in very much just keep exploring your own language, your own limits, your own kind of visuality.
Yes, absolutely. It's curious. It's as if in coming to Europe, first of all she went to Paris, and then she ended up in London.
Mm-hmm.
And from London she developed these incredibly original and striking and strong images and works. But with a strong sense, in a way, of herself, as I said before, of being from Latin America. Yeah. And I think it could be that she was able to be that without it becoming a cliche, because she was a little bit removed from it. And there was a very, very interesting critic, who I think was Argentinian, but lived in Colombia, called Marta Traba.
Mm-hmm.
And Marta Traba was engaged very, 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 very virulently in a kind of battle against the United States in terms of establishing Latin America as an independent identity for artists not being American. She wasn't talking so much about Latin American artists, of course, in the States, but right. Latin America as creating its own identity from there. And I think, as far as I recall, Ofelia did actually go to classes of Marta Traba's at the University in Bogota. So I think Marta Traba, I think that position was sort of reinforced Ophelia's sense of where she came from, but a place from which she came always a little bit removed. It's as though she's always able to reflect back on something that she sees about particularly the kind of popular culture in Barranquilla, which is where she came from, and which she really loved, although she found it quite frightening in some ways. I mean, she said it's a very violent country, Colombia.
Especially then, yeah.
Especially then.
So Dawn, as I'm seeing you, I'm seeing this wonderful work from the Essex collection. In the center, there's a box with a portrait of Diego and Frida. So you've worked, I guess, primarily in surrealism, the history of surrealism, and especially, more specifically, the history of surrealism in Latin America. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see, or not, Ofelia and her relationship to surrealism.
It's a terribly tricky question, Gabriel. Really, no, it's all right. It's very difficult because I think she was quite well aware of surrealism. She didn't really want to identify with it, and yet so much of her practice and her way of thinking as an artist was very, very close to that of the surrealists. I'm not saying she was influenced by it at all, but the emphasis that she placed on intuition and on the absence of a hierarchy between high and low. I mean, she used all kinds of extraordinary bits and pieces that she picked up in flea markets and so on, which clearly have a relationship with the surrealist object, with the idea also the surrealist object brought with it of, through juxtaposition, creating a kind of spark that was something different. I mean, it was like a poetic spark. There's a lot of poetry in surrealism. I think there's actually a lot of poetry in her work. So I think that she was very aware of the tradition of the surrealist object. I feel that I almost see her identified a little bit more with the kind of energy of the Dada object. I mean, there's a sort of almost like a Dada spirit here sometimes. But there's also a quite interesting relationship with Frida Kahlo here, because and you can see Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera in a very famous photograph that Ofelia has stuck inside a little box. And we'll come back to the boxes because they are very important. But Frida Kahlo she was, if you like, she was picked up by the surrealists who discovered her in Mexico and thought, she is fully surrealist without having necessarily known anything about the movement. It's extremely difficult to define surrealism. So, I mean, I don't want to really go down that road a bit, except to say that Surrealism was a movement with no style from a visual point of view. The artists involved were all quite different and doing quite different things. So I'm happy to use the term Surrealism with her. I mean, it is quite fruitful. One could explore it a bit more. Frida Kahlo exhibited with them, and then when Surrealism became less fashionable after the war, not so chic as it had been before, she denied a connection with Surrealism. Ofelia stayed completely, as it were, away from that kind of art world politics, if you like. But there's one work next door, which I'm quite sure is a joke about Surrealism, and that's the painting with a fried egg, model of a fried egg, stuck in the middle, sewn on with thread, and it's floating in the sky. And it's her reference to Salvador Dali, who painted eggs, a famous painting called Fried Eggs on a Plate Without a Plate. That's, so I think she's playing around with it. There are the occasional references to Surrealism. Yeah.
It's, I mean, the other thing, of course, with that photograph, I guess specifically, is the way Frida Kahlo also came to sort of dress up as a Mexican archetype, right? And so there's that question of identity, which, you know, we bordered on. But I want to, in terms of the legacy of Surrealism, to also bring up the term magical realism, which is a sort of specific Latin American twist, maybe, on Surrealism.
It came about from somebody who wanted to distance himself from Surrealism. What's his name?
Gabriel Garcia Marquez?
No, that one.
Writer or painter?
Yes, writer. Never mind.
Alejo Carpentier?
Carpentier, okay. Yes. Right. Carpentier, who coined the term magical realism, realismo mágico, because he claimed that actually in Latin America, what looks pure fantasy in Surrealism was actually real. You know, that you know, it did really rain animals, for example. I mean, there was a kind of idea that, and I think one can understand it better by talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. I don't know whether you've read it. I expect many of you have. But I do think that really is the kind of magical realism that Carpentier had in mind, which is a sort of realism of the memory and the imagination and symbols, like the explorers who come walking through the tropical forest and in a very magical area, and they come across a great early 16th century ship in the middle of the forest. Whether it was really there or not, whether it was just a sort of dream, you don't know. But I think that atmosphere of the magical realism is actually quite important in relation to Ofelia.
Of course, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was from Barranquilla, and so that specific, so they came from the same place, and within the geography, the cultural geography of Colombia, you know, Bogotá is in the mountains and is a much more conservative, I would say, maybe traditional society. The Caribbean coast is, you know, much more Caribbean, and so the culture is more mixed. It's much looser, I guess. I mean, these are all stereotypes, but they serve some function. And she would always make that distinction. Like, I'm from Colombia, but I'm from Barranquilla. Like, I'm not from the uptight part. I'm from the more, you know, relaxed and interesting part. But that relationship with Garcia Marquez, I think, is very much there, where that sense that the everyday is charged with magic, right? So 100 Years of Solitude opens with them with ice, you know, which is a completely banal object for us, but like this thing that just seems to be impossible, but is and triggers the imagination in so many interesting ways. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about her use of objects, right? Because she is bringing all kinds of very kitsch, straightforward objects, mass-produced in many cases, and really kind of infusing them with magic. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and well, the boxes, I think she described them as magic boxes.
She did, they're called magic boxes.
They're called magic boxes,
yeah.
So the boxes that you see through there, some of them with caimans' heads sticking out from them, or with little hearts inside. Now, I used to think that they were they may be related to, but I used to think they were actually the kind of box that you find very much in the Andes, where people would travel with religious scenes, and little portable things that you could take along, and you open the doors, and you could sort of pray to whatever religious scene was inside there. But apparently, thanks to Carmen, I've discovered that the boxes are not. They're boxes that Ofelia found in Paris, and they are key boxes where you would put your keys when you come into the house. You know those little boxes, you close the doors. But I think she's perfectly aware of the tradition of the votive boxes. And I think they are being alluded to here. But there's a very long tradition, I say long tradition, but I mean going back to sort of Dada times, certainly, of artists assembling odd things and putting them together in a box. And of course, one of the great exponents of this is Joseph Cornell, who made his work was entirely boxes. Say more about.
It's interesting. You mentioned Guy Brett before, who was a very important British art historian, critic, who engaged with Latin America very early on in the 1960s, and he had a whole kind of thesis about the importance of the box in his case, in the abstract and constructivist tradition. He was looking at artists like Elio Itisica, Antonio Diaz, many artists who'd used the box as a kind of device. And I think it is that device that separates things from the everyday world somehow. When you open and it kind of controls your vision, and it creates a world within a world. And I think that's maybe what was also of interest to the surrealists broadly defined, was this sense that it's kind of like a portal, right? What happens in the box stays in the box. It's a very a specific little world. Yes. And when you were mentioning the votive, the kind of portable altarpieces, it just made, again, looking, not to keep going on about, but the Frida and Diego, I think there's also a kind of sense of humor there, that these are the artists, particularly in the early 90s, these were the artists people prayed to. Like if you had any knowledge or interest in Latin America, it was Diego and Frida. So I think there, at the same time, I think there was genuine respect. I think there was also maybe a little bit of these are who we pray to. Yeah.
And the other thing about boxes is that they can contain treasure. You can hide treasures in them. And there's a great, in many places in Latin America, which, after the Spaniards arrived in the 16th century, where they're particularly precious idols or objects or sort of power tools would be hidden away in a box under the altar. So you would apparently be worshipping cross, Virgin, so on, but actually, underneath and inside, there was an entirely other set of ideas and values and beliefs. So I think that is also here somehow. Mm-hmm. I feel that, Ofelia had a sense that, there was such a deep history to Latin America, going back such a long way before the arrival of the Spaniards, but of course the whole colonial period was itself tremendously, dominating. Then the period of independence, the struggle of the nations for their own independence. But she had a sense that, okay, she was born in Barranquilla, but actually who was she? What world did she belong to? And that's somehow I feel you also get that in this strange in Macondo, in the 100 Years of Solitude, that although it's so local and specific, there's also a sense of it being floating in a sort of dream world.
I think in a lot of the contexts where there's such a high degree of mestizaje or mix as there is in that part of Colombia especially, so the question of who you are is a very loaded question, because in a sense you can kind of choose, and I think that that sense of choice, then coming to such a completely opposite cultural context like the United Kingdom, but I think there's still something of that. How do I represent myself? At the same time, it's me, but it's not me. And I think we haven't discussed the humor yet, but there's definitely a sense of sort of slippery humor here and making fun of the stereotypes, presenting them, but you're never quite sure how deep it goes.
It's very interesting that you will have noticed that I think it starts around there. She incorporates photocopies of limbs of her, particularly hands, lots of hands. She sticks them onto the eyes, ears. What's that title? It's wonderful titles. Oh yes, lending an ear to the past, right, is the title of one of the works there, and there's a lot of a photocopy of the ear. But it's an interesting contrast with an actual self-portrait. These are not self-portraits. They are kind of almost like a remote. It's her, it's sort of, there she is, and there's her hand, and there's the work. It's as though she's away from it somehow. I'm not putting that very well, but...
No. I mean, it makes me think also, in terms of magical objects, the tradition of the ex voto, which is...
Oh, yes.
Maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, well, of course, Frida Kahlo found a wonderful way, in a sense, of expressing her own feelings, emotions, and so on, by taking the model of the ex voto, or the retablo, which are these little paintings on tin, which you particularly find in Mexico, you also find in Europe, which would be often painted by a jobbing street painter who was totally untrained, and somebody would go along and say, would you please paint me the scene of the time that actually I was saved by my dog from falling into a ravine, and I prayed, I prayed to the Holy Virgin, and the Holy Virgin rescued me and the dog pulled me back. And so the person was set about painting this little scene, and underneath it would say, this has been painted in order to celebrate and to honor the Virgin for saving me from falling into the ravine, written along the bottom. Right. And Frida Kahlo wonderfully picks up this tradition and turns it to her own interests.
And there's another tradition that's very strong in the Catholic Church and very strong in Latin America, which is to, for example, if you've been diagnosed with an ear infection, or then you take a small sculpted ear and you kind of present it to an altar. So you embody, or if you have a heart problem, there's kind of a sculpted heart. And I think there's some of that logic in her work too. If you broke your finger, you take a little sculpture of a finger. So to kind of take the body part and offer it almost as a sacrifice, as for that particular thing to be healed. So I think that these are many references that are there. They're not obvious. They're not, I think, they're not in your face necessarily. But I think for a lot of readers of the work, these references can kind of weave in and out. But one of the things we were talking about before the talk was about how open-ended these works are, and I think that's a really important point. Like I don't think Ofelia was an artist who had a program that she was trying to convince you, this is how things should be, or this is what art is, or this is how we should live, which is an occupational hazard of art, I think, is the desire to kind of want to tell you how to do things, and this is almost a total opposite. And so I think you had some observation about her titles and use of language.
Well, I was going to start by sort of a warning and an apology that we weren't really going to interpret her work, though of course one could try. But it's our difficult job, if you like, to put into words things that exist visually in their own right. So how do you do it? I mean, it's awfully difficult. She knows that perfectly well, and so she's very often talking about in the titles the problem of articulating, of verbally describing things. So one of my favorites is that wonderful work which has, I think she must have picked it up in Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and the title is Wordless with the Virgin of Guadalupe. So wordless, So, and there are other references to through the mouth yet lacking words. That's another of the words. So all I'm really saying is, nonetheless, we do talk about it, And when we do, and there are lots of things one could say more specifically about some of her themes, such as the relationship between nature and the body, nature under threat, objects that could be a cactus or a breast, all sorts of, I mean, that's another thing that's like surrealism, actually. I meant to say that there are kind of, if you like, I mean, wonderful double readings of a lot of her forms and a lot of her creatures and characters. And there are, you know, combinations of things which are completely unusual. I mean, she is completely, really, she is very, very original. But there is this problem of what do we say? Well, I'm not going to say, well, that is, you know, the kind of spikes on top of a dinosaur or caiman or teeth or something. But you can, all those things you might see in it. I mean, I think she wanted them to be open to you to look at them and find your connections and associations, as well as having to read the words of people like ourselves who are art historians and try and interpret it. Sorry.
And I think that also, you know, if we think about the time when she was becoming an artist, in the late 60s, early 70s, and, you know, she landed in Yale. So I think she had to navigate a lot of an art world that was very prescriptive. I think it still is, but I think it's less than it was at certain points in sort of the mid-20th century, where there were very, very strong ideas about what art should be and what it should function and what it should tell you and how to use form. And I think it took sort of remarkable courage when you see, I mean, there are works here from the late 60s, and she's already exploring her own language in a way that I imagine a lot of people must have looked at and just been like, and there's some anecdotes about her, you know, at Yale, just sort of dealing with the late legacy of abstract expressionism in the United States and having people look at her, a young woman from Colombia.
Very glamorous.
Very glamorous. She was absolutely beautiful, extremely magnetic. She was called Ofelia. I mean, she was absolutely like a wonderful person to be around. But, you know, I think that her navigating, we haven't really discussed gender specifically, but there's definitely a question here of her finding her space, not just in terms of her ethnic and geographic, racial identity, but also in terms of her gender identity. And I think it's present in all of her work. There's a very particular kind of sexuality in her work, particular kind of desire, but she never made a program out of it. You know, it's there, but as you said, it's always open to ambiguous readings.
I mean, I really feel that it's sort of coming to its own today. I think at the time, it's really true. I mean, one can't emphasize it enough, what Gabriel was saying, that people really did think there was the correct route for art, the correct route for painters to go down. And she just didn't do it. But I think now there's much greater freedom, and I mean, much less attempt to sort of control things. I think she's speaking to a younger audience, possibly.
I was very pleased to hear Carmen tell us that this exhibition has been very popular, right, with your audience, which I would not have assumed necessarily, and maybe it's for the reasons you say, that, you know, people have maybe a different relationship to visual languages now.
I think so,
yeah.
yes.